Orders were the lifeblood of the Navy SEALs, a sacred oath, etched into bone and marrow. But when General Arthur Wainwright barked the directive to retreat, Sarah Miller looked through her scope and saw not a tactical withdrawal, but a bloodbath. She had one choice: disobey the order or die. Cold was a physical presence in the Hindu Kush, a biting entity that gnawed at the joints and stiffened the trigger finger. Sarah Miller, known in the teams as Hare for her cold-blooded precision and unnerving silence, didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything except the steady, rhythmic thump of her own heart against the frozen rock she pressed her chest into. Through the high-powered optics of her Mk-13 Mod 7, the world was a high-contrast map of greys and muted greens. 700 yards away, the village of Dar el-Zar sat in the valley like a festering wound. It was supposed to be empty. Intelligence filtered through the gold-braided hierarchy back at Bagram Airfield had claimed the valley was a transit point for low-level insurgent supply runs. "Check your sectors," whispered Captain Daniel Halloway over the comms. His voice was a calm murmur, the kind that usually anchored the team. Today it sounded brittle. "Sector clear," replied Miller, her eye never leaving the glass. "But Captain, the thermal signatures I picked up near the north structure, they aren't supply runners. They're too disciplined. They're moving in squads of 4. That's not a transit point. That's a staging ground for an entire battalion." Miller shifted her scope. She was right. She watched as a man in civilian clothing walked out of a hut, checked a watch, a high-end military-grade G-Shock, and signaled a group of men carrying long, heavy cases. "Halloway." Miller breathed her finger, hovering an inch away from the trigger. "We've got heavy weaponry, mortar tubes. We are sitting in a kill box. If we don't relocate, we're going to be turned into mist before the sun hits the ridge." The team was a 4-person fire team: Miller, Halloway, a demolition specialist named Jax, and their communications lead, Reese. They were meant to be observers, the eyes in the sky, but the eyes had seen too much. "Hold anyhow." Halloway commanded. "We wait for the extraction window. If we move now, we break cover. We stay low." Miller sighed, the vapor of her breath disappearing into the biting wind. She trusted Halloway, but her gut, the gut that had pulled her out of 3 near-death experiences in Syria, was screaming that something was fundamentally broken. The intelligence wasn't just wrong, it felt curated. It felt like they had been walked into this valley, led by a breadcrumb trail of bad data, and dropped into the center of a hornet's nest. Then the static crackled. "Team 6, this is command. General Wainwright speaking." The air on the ridge seemed to freeze even harder. General Arthur Wainwright was a legend of the old guard, a man who saw soldiers as pawns on a chessboard, calculated against the geopolitical value of the move. He rarely spoke directly to fire teams. General Halloway responded, his voice snapping to attention. "Captain Halloway, status." "Sir, we're compromised. We're staring at an enemy battalion, not insurgents, requesting immediate extraction via the secondary route to the east." There was a long silence on the line. Too long. Miller shifted her rifle, her eyes scanning the ridgeline for any sign of spotters. She didn't like the silence. It sounded like a decision being made, a decision made by a man miles away in a climate-controlled room staring at a screen. "Negative, Captain?" Wainwright's voice came through devoid of the static that usually plagued the high-altitude transmissions. "You will not move to the east. You are to retreat to the western ridge, the primary extraction point." Miller's stomach dropped. The western ridge was wide open, a barren expanse of scree and shale. To cross it in daylight was suicide. It was the longest, most exposed route possible. "General Nuff." Halloway hesitated. "The western ridge is an open kill zone. We'll be exposed for 3 clicks. We won't make it to the extraction point. That is an order, Captain. Wainwright's voice turned colder, sharpening like a razor. The primary extraction zone is the only location the birds can touch down. Any deviation from the flight path will result in a total loss of air support. Move now. Miller pressed the radio button on her vest. General, this is Miller. With all due respect, the western route is a death trap. I can see the enemy patrols converging on that exact path. They know we're here. They're waiting for us to make that run. Miller, Wainwright snapped. Your job is to follow the chain of command, not to curate the geography. You have your orders. If you deviate, you are AWOL. Execute the retreat. The connection cut. Miller looked up from her scope, her eyes locking onto Holloway. The captain's face was pale, his eyes wide as he processed the implications. He knew the geography as well as she did. He knew that ordering them to take the western ridge was effectively ordering them to execute a suicide run. He's killing us, Holloway whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. Miller felt the cold seep into her bones, not from the winter, but from the realization. This wasn't a mistake. Wainwright wasn't incompetent. He was cold, calculating, and efficient. He wants us dead, Dave, Miller said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He's not trying to save us. He's trying to clear the board. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. Miller scrambled backward from the edge of the ridge, dragging her rifle with her. Her brain was moving at 1,000 miles an hour, cataloguing every piece of intel, every suspicious silence, every weird decision from the high command over the last 3 weeks. Think Holloway, she urged, her voice fierce. Why the western ridge? Why the specific flight path? If we move, the enemy drones pick us up. We're dead in minutes. If we don't, we're insubordinate. If we stay, we die fighting. Holloway rubbed his face, his gloved hands shaking slightly. If we disobey, we lose everything. Our careers, our status. But if we stay... Miller cut in, gesturing toward the valley. We hold the high ground. We have the advantage. We wait for nightfall. We move under the cover of darkness. That is the only way any of us makes it out of here alive. But the general said, the general is wrong. Miller snapped the authority in her voice, cutting through his hesitation. Or he's lying. Look at the grid. Look at the placement of those enemy mortars. They aren't aimed at the village. They're aimed at the western ridge. He wants us to walk into that funnel. Suddenly the world exploded. A mortar round impacted 50 yards to their left, sending a plume of rock and debris into the air. The concussion rattled Miller's teeth, and for a second the world went white. Then the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of heavy machine gun fire began to rake the ridgeline. Contact! Jax screamed from the forward position. They know exactly where we are. They have our coordinates, Miller realized instantly. The radio, the beacon, they're tracking us through the command link. The radio in Holloway's ear blared again. Holloway, you are not moving. Move to the western ridge immediately. That is your extraction point. The gunfire intensified. A bullet whizzed past Miller's ear, the sound like a cracking whip. She watched as Jax fired back his suppressive fire, ineffective against the hardened positions in the valley. They were being pinned. Miller didn't think. She acted. She reached up to her chest, grabbed her comms unit, and ripped it off her vest with enough force to snap the strap. She held it for a second, a black, sleek piece of technology that was their lifeline to command, and then with a look of absolute, terrifying clarity, she smashed it against the jagged edge of the rock. The plastic cracked the internal circuitry, spilling out like guts. "Miller, what are you doing?" Holloway shouted over the roar of incoming fire. "I'm cutting the leash," she roared back. She threw the ruined radio down the slope, watching it tumble into the abyss below. "They're tracking us. As long as we're on that net, we're dead. We go dark." "Now," Holloway stared at her, the chaos of the firefight swirling around them. For a moment, the madness of the situation hung in the air. The rogue sniper, the dying comms, the general who wanted them to walk into a kill box. "Go dark," Holloway repeated, a grim smile touching his lips. He unclipped his own radio and tossed it into the dirt. "Jax, Reese, cut the net. We're going off-grid." The silence that followed was strange. It was a tactical silence. With the radios gone, the external influence of the general evaporated. There was only the sound of the wind, the heavy respiration of the team, and the relentless enemy fire. But now they were alone, and being alone was the only thing that had ever saved them. Miller took a deep breath, checked the chamber of her rifle, and adjusted her scope. The enemy was closing in, but for the first time that day, the tactical situation belonged to them. "They think we're running," Miller said, her eye against the sight, tracking a silhouette moving toward their flank. "They think we're marching into the funnel. They don't know we're standing our ground." "What's the play, Herr?" Holloway asked, shifting his position to cover the rear. "We make them pay for every inch," Miller said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "And then when the sun goes down, we disappear." The enemy infantry was moving up the slope, arrogant in their certainty that the Americans would obey their orders. They were moving in a line, exposed and confident. Miller exhaled. The world slowed down. The heartbeat of the wind, the pulse of her blood, the gravity of the earth, it all aligned. She didn't lead the shot. She didn't have to. She knew exactly where the lead insurgent would be in half a second. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked the sound, a singular sharp retort that shattered the chaos of the firefight. 200 yards away, the man in the lead dropped his momentum, carrying him backward into the man behind him. "Target down," Miller said, her voice devoid of emotion. The enemy stalled. They hadn't expected fire from this position, the position the general had ordered them to abandon. "They're hesitating," Reese yelled. "Good," Miller said, sliding the bolt back to chamber another round. "Keep them suppressed. If they want this ridge, they're going to have to walk over a mountain of their own bodies to get it." The battle for the ridge had begun, and for the first time, Sarah Miller was fighting on her own terms. Twilight in the Hindu Kush didn't arrive with a gentle fading of light. It fell like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in 30 minutes, freezing the sweat against their skin and turning the jagged shale of the ridgeline into treacherous ice. For 4 hours, the 4-person fire team had held their ground against a vastly superior force. Sarah Miller's shoulder ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. The recoil pad of the Mk-13 Mod 7 had bruised her down to the bone, a physical testament to the 22 confirmed kills she had racked up since dropping her radio. Down in the valley, the enemy had learned a brutal lesson. The high ground was fortified by a ghost who did not miss. They had stopped trying to rush the slope, opting instead to probe the flanks, searching for a weak point in the SEALs' defense. "Jax, talk to me." Captain Daniel Holloway hissed his breath, pluming in the freezing air. His assault rifle was resting on a flat rock, scanning the eastern approach. Jackson Hayes, the team's demolitions expert, was belly-crawling back from a cluster of boulders 30 yards to their left. "Claymores are set. I rigged the secondary charges to a tripwire along the goat path. If they try to sweep us from the blind side, they're going to catch a face full of steel ball bearings and C4. "Good," Holloway muttered. "Reese, anything on the localized scanners?" Brian Reese was huddled in a small depression in the rock, shielding the faint green glow of a modified field tablet with his tactical jacket. With their primary comms shattered at the bottom of a ravine, Reese had spent the last hour hacking into a captured shortwave radio they had stripped from a scout they'd ambushed days ago. "Captain, you're not going to like this," Reese said, his voice tight with disbelief. "I managed to intercept the enemy's localized comms. They aren't speaking standard Pashto or Arabic. It's a mix of Russian and a localized dialect. Private military contractors, mercenaries. But that's not the worst part." Miller racked the bolt of her rifle, ejecting a spent brass casing that clinked loudly against the stone. She didn't look away from her scope, but her ears were tuned entirely to Reese. "Spit it out, Brian," Miller said. "They aren't just hunting us," Reese explained, tapping the screen to bring up a decrypted data packet. "They're protecting a logistical corridor. I pulled a manifest from their transmission burst. Weapons, heavy artillery, and massive shipments of unrefined lithium. But it's the routing code that's damning. It's an American military encryption key authorizing the transport. A blind eye bought and paid for." Holloway froze, turning slowly to look at the communications specialist. "Are you telling me General Wainwright is facilitating an arms and mineral smuggling ring? I'm telling you the routing key belongs to his specific command sector at Bagram," Reese corrected grimly. "This valley isn't a transit point for low-level insurgents. It's Wainwright's private black market highway. We were sent here on bogus intelligence so we could be wiped out. If we saw the operation, we were liabilities. He ordered us to the Western Ridge because he sold our extraction coordinates to these mercenaries. He packaged us up and served us on a silver platter." The silence on the ridge was deafening, broken only by the howling wind. The ultimate betrayal. They weren't fighting for their country today. They were fighting to survive a corrupt general's bookkeeping error. Miller felt a cold fury settle in her chest, far sharper than the mountain air. "He thought we'd just follow orders," she whispered. "He thought we were good little dogs who would march into the slaughterhouse because a voice on the radio told us to. We need to move." Holloway said his command presence returning with a hard and ruthless edge. The hesitation was gone. Night has fallen. The thermals on those mercenaries will be blinded by the ambient rock temperature dropping so fast. We do not go west. We go east straight up over the summit and down into the Koragal Basin. East is a 70-degree incline, Jax pointed out, packing his remaining explosives into his rucksack. "It's a vertical ice wall." "Then we climb," Miller stated, pulling her rifle into her chest and snapping the scope covers shut. "They expect us to bleed out here or run to the extraction point. We go up and over and we take this intel straight to the Inspector General. Wainwright wants to play God with our lives. We bring heaven crashing down on his head." The team moved like shadows. Leaving the fortified position meant stepping out of the relative safety of their cover and into the biting, exposed darkness of the mountain face. They moved in standard tactical formation, trusting their night vision goggles, NVGs, to paint the world in a luminescent green hue. The climb was agonizing. Every handhold was a gamble against crumbling shale. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. Miller took the lead, her lithe frame and exceptional balance, allowing her to pick the safest route up the sheer face. Her hands, despite the heavy tactical gloves, were bruised and bleeding, the cold numbing the pain but stealing her dexterity. Halfway up the face, a dull thump echoed from the valley below, followed by the brilliant, blinding arc of a white phosphorus flare shooting into the night sky. "Don't look at the light," Holloway ordered harshly. They all pressed their faces against the freezing stone, squeezing their eyes shut beneath their NVGs to prevent the brilliant light from washing out their night vision and temporarily blinding them. The flare illuminated the ridge they had just abandoned. Below them they heard the sharp, frantic shouts of the mercenaries, realizing their prey had vanished. A moment later, a massive explosion rocked the mountain. A shock wave rippled through the rock face, vibrating through Miller's chest. Jax let out a low, grim chuckle. They found the tripwire on the goat path. "Keep moving," Holloway commanded. "They know we didn't go west now. They'll start sweeping the peaks." For 6 hours they climbed. They defied the limits of human endurance, fueled entirely by spite and the absolute necessity of survival. When they finally crested the summit, the wind nearly tore them off their feet. Before them lay the Koragal Basin, a vast, dark wilderness that Wainwright's drones were not currently patrolling. They had slipped the noose. But the war wasn't over. It had simply changed coordinates. Surviving the wilderness was only the first phase of the operation. The second was navigating the treacherous waters of military bureaucracy without being silenced. It took the team 3 agonizing days to cross the basin. They marched on 0 rations, melting snow in their mouths for hydration, and sleeping in alternating 2-hour shifts in hidden snow caves. By the time they reached the outskirts of Forward Operating Base, FOB Alpha, a Marine outpost 60 miles east of their original drop zone, they looked like ghosts. Their uniforms were shredded, their faces hollowed out by exhaustion and windburn, their eyes burning with a relentless feral intensity. They didn't walk through the front gates. To do so would trigger an automatic report up the chain of command, alerting General Wainwright that SEAL Team 6 had inexplicably survived his death trap. Instead, Miller bypassed the perimeter sensors, using a blind spot she had catalogued months prior. They slipped into the motor pool under the cover of a sandstorm, moving with the terrifying silence that only elite operators possessed. "Reese, find a secure hard line," Holloway ordered, leaning heavily against the rusted hull of a decommissioned Humvee. Not Siponet, something completely outside Wainwright's network. Reese nodded, slipping toward the communications tent. 10 minutes later, he returned a grim smile, cracking his wind-chapped lips. "I bypassed the local router and piggybacked on a secure satellite uplink belonging to the CIA detachment here. We have a direct encrypted line to the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC Oversight Committee in D.C. I've already uploaded the decrypted manifest and the routing keys linking Wainwright to the smuggling ring." "Good," Miller said, resting her heavy rifle against the tire. She looked at Holloway. "Now we make the call." Back at Bagram Airfield, General Arthur Wainwright sat behind a polished mahogany desk, sipping a cup of black coffee. The war was a business, and business was thriving. The loss of the SEAL team was a regrettable but necessary line item in his ledger. They had been listed as missing in action, presumed dead, after failing to reach the western extraction point. The narrative was clean. The lithium and weapons were flowing. His offshore accounts were heavy. The secure phone on his desk rang. It wasn't the standard digital trill of base communications. It was the heavy jarring ring of the red line, the direct secure channel from the Pentagon. Wainwright set his coffee down, adjusted his posture, and picked up the receiver. "Wainwright?" "General Wainwright, this is Admiral Thomas Vance, JSOC Oversight." A stern, gravelly voice echoed through the earpiece. "Admiral, what can I do for you at this hour?" Wainwright asked, keeping his tone perfectly measured. "You can remain precisely where you are, General. Military police are currently entering your command center." Wainwright's brow furrowed. "Admiral, I demand an explanation. What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Arthur, is that dead men tell no tales, but your men aren't dead," the Admiral replied coldly. "We just received a highly classified data dump from FOB Alpha. It includes intercepted mercenary communications, black market manifests, and an American military routing key with your digital signature attached to it." Wainwright felt the blood drain from his face. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the receiver. "That is fabricated intelligence. Who is feeding you this? I am General." The voice on the line shifted. It was no longer the Admiral. It was a woman's voice, cold, steady, and utterly void of fear. "Miller?" Wainwright breathed the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. "You told us to go to the Western Ridge, General." Sarah Miller's voice crackled over the secure satellite line. "You told us it was the only way out. But you forgot one crucial detail about the teams you send into the dark." Wainwright stood up, his eyes darting toward his office door as he heard the heavy boots of military police in the hallway. "You're committing treason, Miller. You broke the chain of command. You went AWOL." "No, sir." Miller replied to the ice in her voice, matching the freezing winds of the Hindu Kush. "We didn't break the chain of command. We severed a rotten link. You wanted to clear the board. General, the board is cleared. Checkmate. The line went dead. Seconds later, the heavy oak doors of Wainwright's office burst open. 4 heavily armed military police officers stormed in, their weapons lowered but ready. Behind them walked a stern-faced JAG officer holding a thick file. General Arthur Wainwright, the JAG officer, announced, his voice carrying the inescapable weight of federal law. You are relieved of your command. You are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, arms trafficking, and the attempted murder of Allied personnel. Surrender your sidearm and step away from the desk. Wainwright stood frozen, staring at the dead phone in his hand. The empire he had built in the shadows, the millions he had secured in blood money, all of it had been dismantled by a single sniper who refused to blindly follow orders. He slowly reached to his hip, unclipped his holster, and placed his sidearm on the desk. Thousands of miles away, in the dusty, oil-stained motor pool of FOB Alpha, Sarah Miller handed the encrypted receiver back to Reese. The tension that had kept her muscles coiled tight for 4 days finally broke. She didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She just let out a long, ragged exhale, feeling the true exhaustion of the mission finally crashing over her. Holloway walked over, clapping a heavy, dirt-caked hand on her shoulder. We did it, Herr. We actually did it. Miller looked up at the harsh, unforgiving sun rising over the desert basin. They had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, completely surrounded, outgunned and betrayed by their own commander. But they had survived because they remembered the most fundamental rule of warfare: trust. The team, trust your instincts, and never walk into a trap just because someone with a star on their collar tells you to. Yeah, Captain, Miller said, softly, finally letting her guard down as the adrenaline faded into the quiet hum of victory. We did it. Now let's go home. This is just the beginning of a desperate fight for survival against betrayal. When command turns against its own, the only path forward is through the fire. If you're hooked by Miller's defiance and the high-stakes tension of this operation, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion of this intense story. Share it with a friend who loves a good military thriller. The final stand is coming. Stay tuned.